The winter road home is several kilometers of dirty snow, cold and angry people trying to disperse on a narrow path trodden to the point of mud. Many people walk this road, rich and poor. It unites them on the way from work to home. It all starts in December. Snowfalls, one after another, cover the village with snow until the strength of the local janitors runs out. At such times, it is especially difficult to leave the house, even if this house is a couple of dozen carelessly stacked logs. The rural school is another curse. Located on the top of a hill, about 40 meters from the exit to the federal highway. It is the outermost building in the village, and its eastern wing is the farthest place from the village that a typical local resident under the age of 13 could visit. At that time, it was a village for people tired of the bustle of the city and those who could not afford this bustle. Here was everything you needed for life. And, at the same time, there was nothing that would make this life pleasant. 200 inhabitants, 200 kilometers to the nearest large city. No phone, no TV, just the local library and satellite service in good weather, which was surprisingly rare. The old massive door leading to the local administration building shook and creaked. Someone was pushing it with all his might from the inside, but backed by a sizable snowdrift. The door was in no hurry to give way. A few more efforts moved the door about 10 centimeters, until a man invisible to people from the street attacked it with all his weight. Only then the door swung open and a short, thin woman in a heavy, warm coat and mittens appeared on the threshold. Barely able to stay on her feet, she hastily closed the door, waving goodbye to the lonely cleaning lady, who, in order not to walk through the cold into the night, was accustomed to staying at her workplace at night. A sharp wind, as if full of needles, burned my cheeks, even after a whole day of work. I didn't want to go home, knowing that no one was waiting for her there, except, of course, her mother, whose attention Anna, that was the girl's name, tried with all her might to avoid. This was her life these 3 years. The memory of the past had already faded, turning from a bright film into an old photograph, but she still continued to remember where it all began. "Are you sure you should continue driving the car in this condition?" Anna asked her husband, who had just replaced her at the wheel. "Which like this?" This was the end of their honeymoon, which they spent in Krasnodar and were now returning back to Moscow. Anna did not expect such a sharp answer, but still courageously continued, trying to smooth out all possible corners. "You haven't slept for 3 days. I heard you throwing up this morning. That's why we left." "I'm fine." It seems that the man's voice softened and he looked guiltily at his wife. "True, and I'm fine. Besides, I laid out the cards yesterday, and I don't like what I saw in them." Sighing strangely, the man clasped his slightly trembling hands on the steering wheel, and Anna noticed how veins bulged on one of them. "We still had to go back, now that your father has died. It must be hard for her." Anna shrugged. Her father was a rare visitor in her childhood, as well as in her mother's life. Working as a psychic predictor, he toured throughout the entire Union, and settled his family in the deepest hole that he could find. The girl shuddered at the mere thought of going there for the wake. "Why don't we just move her closer to us?" she wanted to ask, but her husband's deep, convulsive sigh interrupted her mid-sentence. "I'm sorry. What happened? How are you?" Abruptly turning away from the window, Anna looked with a panicked look at her husband's pale face. The steering wheel in his hand shook to the side, and the girl had to intercept it in order to keep the car on the road. "Brake, at least let off the gas." I'm falling. I'm sorry." "What?" Anna looked at her husband with horror. Noticing this, he tried to smile reassuringly, but instead, half of his face scrunched up while the other half remained motionless. My right hand completely fell off the steering wheel. He began to sag, sliding out of the chair, the belt fastened across his stomach resting against his convulsively rising and falling chest. "Oh my God," Anna managed to whisper. "Let go." With his eyes wide open, the man jerked with his whole body. His legs hit under the dashboard, pressing the gas and brake pedals simultaneously to the floor itself. The steering wheel tore out of Anna's hands. The car went into a skid and, breaking through the flimsy inner fence of the track, flew into the oncoming lane. The first 2 cars passing by were able to avoid the danger, but the third was not so lucky. The small but heavy Fiat hit the trunk with force, almost tearing it off. The car spun even more. Smoke poured out from under the wheels. The next car, which also did not have time to brake, hit the driver's door, crushing both the driver and passenger. Anna came to her senses already in the hospital. Surprisingly, she was almost unharmed. As for her husband, according to doctors, he died before the collision from a massive stroke. having quickly collected her things and rented out the apartment for a long-term lease. Anna, forgetting about her previous fear of a long trip, hastily moved to her mother in the village to put her thoughts in order. She was quickly hired as a secretary in the administration. Mired in routine, low-paid work, Anna lost the passage of time. Contrary to expectations, the burden of grief did not become lighter, smeared over the slice of life in a thin layer. It continued to poison her life every hour. But soon Anna was able to get used to this taste. Ahead lay only a snow-covered road and an old, slightly rickety wooden two-story house in which he and his mother lived in isolation from everything. This house was very old, one of the oldest in the entire village. Previously, no one had lived in it for decades, and even the last few years of Anna's mother's efforts did not in any way correct its image of an old ruin. Gray, cracked wooden walls, windows covered with thick, bubbly glass. It seemed that it was frozen out of time and was always their place, ancient, unshakable, but at the same time ridiculously fragile, crackling and crunching with every breath of cold wind. It greeted everyone who dared to pass by. The first floor, half immersed in the ground, served as a cellar for a long time, but with the advent of electricity and a store in the village, there was no need for it, and since then no one has gone there. The second floor was divided in half, into an unheated entryway and a relatively small living area with a large Russian stove in the center of the dining room with rooms of different sizes extending from it. Opening the gate, Anna prepared herself in advance for the barking, and here it is from under the porch. Semyon, a huge wolfhound who was guarding a barn with animals, recognized the mistress and raised his voice, but did not want to get out of his hiding place. Lazy bastard, Anna grinned. The window of my mother's room had already gone out. People accustomed to city life do not go to bed so early, but Anna has already adapted to the new rhythm. The watch on her wrist showed 8:15 in the evening. Having locked the door behind her, going up to the second floor and passing through the empty, unheated entryway, Anna immediately went to the living part of the house, to her own place, to a small corner room with 2 windows, where her father first brought her 10 years ago. There was already a basin for washing by the bed, soap on a saucer, and on the bedspread on the bed there was a sausage sandwich wrapped in a bag and tea in a thermos. The water in the basin had cooled down, but the tea was hot. Laying down on the bed, the girl immediately fell asleep, trying not to think that tomorrow was Saturday and she wouldn't be able to hide at work. The moon appeared from behind the clouds. Artem, a 12-year-old student at a local school, opened his eyes before the alarm clock set for midnight had time to ring. Fully dressed, he was already sweating quite a bit, lying under the blanket, but the energy was seething in his veins, and he simply did not notice it. "Artem, are you sure?" Sasha, a school friend, asked him this morning. "This is someone else's house." Looking down at his friend and taking a deep breath, as if gathering his thoughts before explaining something terribly simple to an outright fool, Artyom poked his finger in Sasha's ribs. "If you don't go, then I'll go myself, and you're a coward." In fact, Artem was bluffing, although he did not fully understand it. The old house terrified him, like any other teenager, but the story of his older brother that once there, in the incredible depths of the basement, there was a madhouse in which the most dangerous maniacs of the USSR were locked up gave him enough curiosity to decide that it is absolutely necessary for him to get into this basement. However, this determination was also based on the fact that he would not go there alone. "But they live there. And there is a dog," Sasha whined as usual. However, from the very first words, Artem realized that these were not even excuses. His younger friend just needed additional confidence and, of course, he planned to do everything so that he would have it. "The dog knows me. I've been feeding it for a long time. And the hostess always goes to bed early. I've been following them for the past 2 weeks. Are you sure about this?" Sasha practically whispered. "Are you sure SAG is sleeping?" "Of course he's sleeping," Artem answered impatiently. "Well, or sits in the dark, doing nothing. Think by yourself." That's what they decided on. Oddly enough, despite the lack of talent and more than average abilities, Artem was among the most diligent students in the class. Selflessly completing every task set by the teacher, he made hundreds of mistakes, rewriting the same example several times, which is why each page of his notebook turned into a real mess of crossed out and rewritten numbers or sentences depending on the lesson. Artem was not a man of talent. He was someone who achieves everything with self-confidence and donkey stubbornness. Hitting the walls over and over again, but eventually breaking through them because I simply did not see any other options for the development of events. He prepared to enter the basement with equal, if not greater, diligence. Having shown his mother his completed homework in advance, he quietly collected the necessary clothes in his room, stole his father's powerful lantern from the barn, and even stole some food to bribe the dog and himself for the journey in case the hike was delayed. Also, in his backpack were matches and a small flask of alcohol, which his father always carried with him on hikes. Who knows, he'll have to make a fire in the wind? Carefully opening the window, the boy climbed out in complete darkness, and then also carefully closed it and silently jumped into a snowdrift that had been previously checked for dangerous branches. He will return back through the door, hiding the equipment in the yard. If they see him, he will say that he went to the toilet. Quickly moving his feet across the snow-filled yard, Artem slipped through the gate, and within 5 minutes, he and Sasha headed towards the old house. It stood apart from the other houses and looked almost peaceful, covered in a thick layer of white January snow. The gate opened silently, but an unkind grumbling was immediately heard from under the porch. "Be quiet. It's me," Artyom whispered, and the grumbling stopped. 2 green eyes, full of evil fire, looked out of the darkness while the boy took a chicken leg out of his backpack. Having thrown the meat under the porch and making sure that the offering was accepted, Artyom pushed Sasha, who had already begun to tremble with fear, forward into the yard. As in many old houses, the entrance to the cellar was located separately from the main entrance, apparently in order to prevent unnecessary heat from escaping. The old door, lopsided on its hinges, was located at the very end of the yard, near the barn, and was so heavily covered with snow that the boys did not immediately find it. However, soon, the light of his father's lantern illuminated the brass handle. "I told you that I know what's where," Artem boasted. "Yeah," confirmed Sasha. "Let's hurry up before the owners wake up." There was no lock on the door. Having strained, the guys lifted her up. The hinges creaked, but this quiet sound could not cover the sounds of the house. With every gust of wind, it creaked louder, like an old, dissatisfied patient who could not find peace on his hospital bed. A light cloud of steam escaped from behind the door. Holding the door, the guys squeezed through the dark crack that opened and began to carefully go down the stairs leading down, ending in a long corridor leading into the darkness. The beam of the flashlight illuminated it and the stone walls of the basement, along which old wooden doors were located one after another. "Wow," Sasha admired. "Everything is made of stone." "Be quiet," Artyom thought intensely. "Do you think it looks like a hospital? And how?" Taking out the phone from his pocket, a gift from his father, almost completely useless in the village, but still causing fierce envy among his classmates, Sasha took several pictures. "Let's go somewhere?" The first door was closed, the next one after her too. Artyom, biting his lip with displeasure, pushed the third one and it finally opened, deafening the guys with a dissatisfied creak. In a small room there is a warehouse for gardening tools. The instruments, which had already rotted due to dampness, hung on the walls and simply lay on the floor. In addition to rakes and hoes, there were also several mops and a package of new replacement cuttings. "Nothing," Sasha said disappointedly, "but just in case." He took a couple more photographs. "Can we go already?" "There's nothing here." Artyom did not answer. Going back out into the corridor, he pushed several more locked doors until he stopped at the last one and ended the corridor, which made it seem like the main one, although it looked the same as the others. For some reason, Sasha suddenly felt uneasy. "At least it's closed too." He had time to think, but Artyom pushed it and the door unexpectedly opened easily, as if someone had recently lubricated the hinges. The stone walls, covered with a thick layer of plaster, seemed to reflect the light of the lantern, making the room it revealed seem brightly lit. On the wall opposite the door hung the only object in the entire room, a high-length mirror in a heavy wooden frame. At the bottom, like in a museum, a small rectangle of a sign, yellowed with age, was attached to it. "Therapeutic area, strictly one entry at a time." On the polished mirror surface, the faces of the guys were reflected, pale from dust, with huge, black eyes due to a long stay in the dark. "I'm scared," Sasha whispered, no longer trying to hide it. "Let's get out of here." "Go," he answered his friend and, without waiting for any objections, he entered the room and closed the door behind him. Silence reigned in the room. Artyom expected that the fear that had left him in the presence of his cowardly friend was about to return, but instead, he felt a new surge of strength. Shining a light into the mirror, he came close to it. Unlike the rest of the basement, it was clean, as if it had recently been dusted. Shrugging his shoulders, Artyom carefully examined the frame and realized what had scared Sasha so much. The frame of the mirror was covered with an elaborate bas-relief depicting twisted naked bodies of people. Elongated faces were contorted in pain, arms and legs twisted into unimaginable shapes, as if the carver despised real anatomy and therefore followed some other one, known only to him. This is hell. Running his palm over the bas-relief, Artyom felt disgust. His reflection, as expected, repeated his every movement, but as if everything was very late. And this finally attracted the boy's attention. Having carefully looked at himself in the light of a flashlight, he decided that it was his imagination, but there was clearly something wrong with the reflection. Do I always smile so disgustingly? He thought before realizing that only the reflection was smiling, and not himself. There was no doubt. His reflection smiled. No, not like that, it smiled brazenly. Looking at him, Artyom felt his face uncertainly. He was definitely not smiling. Meanwhile, the reflection became increasingly frantic. The lips parted, revealing snow-white teeth clenched into a terrible grin. The corners of the mouth rose so high that the cheeks could close the eyes. The shadows around began to tremble. The hands holding the lantern trembled. Artyom spun around in place, looking for the door, but there was no door behind him. On every wall around him hung a mirror, in each of which Artyom was reflected. His face distorted with a smile, frantically looking around in all directions. The boy was ready to scream when the door was finally found. The owner of the house opened it and Artyom ran towards her with all his might. The mirrors and reflections disappeared and the room seemed to go dark as the boy found himself back in the hallway and the door slammed behind him. An elderly woman, wrapped in a gray, light robe that was unsuitable for the weather, was without a doubt the mistress of the house where he broke into without permission. But the boy was glad to see her as he had never been glad to anyone before. "What are you doing here?" the woman asked. "Sorry, Auntie." Artyom still hadn't come to his senses, but the woman didn't scream and he risked asking a question. "What kind of mirror is this? Are you talking about what's behind the door?" She clarified. "It's not for people like you. It's for those who have lost someone." Artyom didn't understand. Deciding to raise his eyes and look at the hostess, he noticed more and more terrifying details in her ordinary, slightly disheveled appearance. Her nose sunk deep into her face. Her eyes sparkled with a greenish light, like those of a wild animal, reflecting the light of a flashlight. There was some unnatural awkwardness in her very pose, as if she was not standing, but was standing on her feet, like a puppet suspended by invisible strings. "My daughter looks in this mirror," the woman explained and smiled a crooked, sad smile. Artyom swallowed, not wanting to hear the answer to his next question. "Who died?" "Everyone died for her," the woman sighed. Anna woke up, threw back the blanket with a sharp movement and, as if automatically, felt her slippers on the floor with her feet. Something bad had happened. She could feel it by the way the house shook. Quickly throwing her fur coat right over her nightgown, the girl rushed to the basement, at the entrance to which stood her mother. "What happened?" the girl asked sharply. "Who's there?" "Nobody. I let him go." The way her mother's body looked reminded Anna of how illusory her attempts to bring her back to life with the help of her father's mirror had been, and yet they could communicate, and that was no small achievement. "Who was that?" "Doesn't matter, but he looked," the deceased answered sadly. Her arms hung limply along her body, only the eyes remained alive, in which the emerald flame splashed with an unkind light. "So what now?" Anna's anger seemed to become tangible. She hated having her things touched. "Has anyone else appeared?" No, he had no one to resurrect, and his spirit remained intact, since the mirror had no one to replace it. But it touched him, weighed him, tasted him, and he saw where it was getting us from. "You? Dead people. A child cannot bear this." To the child, Anna's anger evaporated, and she felt what she had felt for the last 3 years, despair. "You must tell me who it was." "Don't make me," the ghost asked. But Anna's will was already winning, and all she could do was close her eyes before the name she wanted to hide was forcibly torn out of her. "Sorry, but I can't allow myself to be disturbed, even if it's a child," Anna said, again returning the will to the enslaved ghost of her mother. "This is mistake," the ghost whispered. "You couldn't let me go, daughter." She did not want. "When I returned and saw that I was also dead." "What will you do now? Will you bring him back like you brought me back?" "I miss him." Tears flowed from the girl's eyes. "You know. But why do you need this child? He came himself. 2 lives in exchange for 1. That's fair. But what you did is not life." The ghost screamed, grabbing at this. Confusion. You yourself don't see what you've turned yourself into. To the desecrator of graves. And kill. I don't want to hear it. Clenching her fists, the girl looked with rage at the revived, but not resurrected body of her mother. I couldn't return it because, having paid for you, I had nothing more to pay the mirror for it. But now, it looks like I have a fee to return everything that was taken from me. Opening the door, Anna went down to the basement. The boy's reflection was sitting in the back room, right on the floor. An ominous, painful smile froze on his face. You come? Artem asked, peering at Anna with unseeing eyes. I like his soul. Bring him and you can choose again. I'll bring it. And who do you want to return in return? There are many suitable bodies in these rooms. You know who, Anna answered,